Guess what? It's more questions for atheists! Don't groan, because these aren't the standard fare that we're all tired of. These might actually be something interesting. Maybe. We'll see. I guess sometimes miracles do happen. But can we actually come up with good answers for the questions? Well, yes, we can. But I'm willing to bet that our answers won't mean much to the religious, because they don't actually care what we have to say. Still, you gotta do what you gotta do, right? So let's get to it. Today we're going to take a look at a small channel called This Saint's Theory, because he's got a bunch of questions for atheists and we do that. But this isn't the same old tired, oft-debunked nonsense that we usually see. This is a whole bunch of new questions, and for that I do congratulate the creator. We don't see a lot of that, so I'm thankful when we do. So anyway, can we answer them? Well, of course we can. We always can. We've never found a single question that we couldn't address, and it never really goes well for the theist. So let's not keep anyone waiting. Away we go.
The following questions are not intended to prove or disprove any single person's ideology, including my own. They are simply inquiries and curiosities I have in an attempt to better understand and connect with the other.
Okay, I've got a question for you. I know this comes out of the blue, but I do. Hold up for a second. Why is your text so dim? We can hardly read it. Anyway, this video is a year or two old, and I'm always happy to answer questions for atheists, whatever, but this is one I haven't gone after before, so I figured why the heck not. This Saint's Theory is a little tiny channel, and sometimes little channels are the most entertaining to take a look at because they're not out there trying to make a big crowd of people happy. So hopefully this gets a little bit brighter and these questions aren't the typical gotcha fare that we see so often from the religious. So let's all keep our fingers crossed and let's get going.
If you or someone you know can answer any of the following questions, then please post the answers in the comment section below or email them to me at stevenrsmelanich@gmail.com. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to email you anything because I get enough spam as it is, but once this hits YouTube, I will certainly put a link in the comments, and if he's really interested, maybe he can come over and we can have an intelligent conversation. Wouldn't that be nice? If this keeps going on, I'm going to have to mess with the contrast from here on out, so we don't have to look at a nearly black screen. We'll give it a little bit of time just in case, but if this just keeps going and it starts to look post-processed, that's why. Anyway, I hope it's not too bad.
If you came face to face with God, would you still deny him?
No, since I'd have evidence for God then, and that would be sufficient to believe. It's all about the evidence, it's not about the belief. Now, that doesn't mean that I'd bow down and worship said God, because belief and worship are two entirely different things. Worship, if I was amenable to doing it at all, which generally I'm not, that would have to be deserved, and threats and fear and things like that, those are not good reasons to bow down to anything. Most gods that we hear about, they tend to be douchebags, and I'm not worshiping a douchebag, sorry. I'm also assuming that this whole thing is from a Mormon perspective, which, granted, we don't get a lot of around here, so this could actually be interesting. Also, I didn't have to touch the contrast. It just became readable when he got to the question, so I don't know what was going on there. Maybe in the future, maybe you should do that for the whole video. Just saying. This is just a helpful hint.
What would you ask God if you saw him?
I'd ask, why are you such a dick? The Bible, at least, is a laundry list of God's complete failures and monstrosity. If there was ever a reason to actively hate a God, the Bible is it. Now, it's been a very long time since I've read the Book of Mormon, so I don't want to delve into it too deeply because I really don't want to go read it again, but I don't really remember being that impressed with much of anything in there either, so, God, what the hell is wrong with you? That would be my question.
Would it be reasonable to say that all things denote there is a God?
Nope. Absolutely nothing that I've ever seen demonstrates the existence of any God anywhere. Just because you really, really want it to be true, that doesn't mean that it is. This is why we need evidence, not just blind faith and wishful thinking. I'm not interested in what makes you feel good. I'm interested in what you can demonstrate is actually true outside of your own fevered brain. And this is really a shame that the religious have absolutely none of that, isn't it? Because that's the problem that we have with every theist, every apologist, every time. Because they've got absolutely nothing.
Are you sure that we could 100% say that there is no intelligence that created the universe when we haven't even searched the farthest reaches of the universe or time or dimensions?
No, nor do I have to. See, here's the thing. The time to believe anything at all, no matter what it is when you have sufficient evidence at hand to demonstrate that it's actually real. It is utterly idiotic to say, well, you can't prove it isn't there, so you ought to believe it. That's stupid. I'm sorry, it just is. If you follow that line of thinking consistently, which is one thing that the religious are really bad at, consistency, but if you do it all the time like that, you wind up believing everything. Every conceivable proposition you have to believe, because you can't prove that non-existent things are non-existent. And that means you have to believe in every single God, because you have no way of proving that any God doesn't exist. Your faith doesn't matter. Only the evidence does. You'd have to believe in Bigfoot and alien abductions and Martians. This whole thing just gets stupid. So the religious don't do that, but they somehow expect us to do it instead. Yeah, like I said, that's really stupid, isn't it? It's not on us to prove that you're wrong. It's on you to prove that you're right. And unfortunately, the track record for the religious is utterly horrible. Maybe you ought to be better. I don't know, just saying.
Is it possible that there are beings in the sixth dimension or higher, which would be gods compared to us?
Demonstrate that any of that is more than just word salad. Go right ahead, because I'm not interested in what you believe. I only care what you can prove, what you can defensively show is actually accurate with evidence. And this is where faith gets you absolutely nowhere, because faith doesn't actually correlate to objective reality in any demonstrable way. This is all just a bunch of religious gobbledygook that the religious embrace because they've been indoctrinated into it from a very young age, before they had any kind of reason in their head that could differentiate between, nonsense and truth. Because truth is all that matters, and nonsense doesn't. But this doesn't work on anybody else, anybody who hasn't had that crap shoved into their heads. And it especially doesn't work on skeptics who take one look at that question and just roll our eyes. Demonstrate your assertions first, then we'll talk. And that's why most of these conversations are so short. Because the second that they see that we're not going to just fall for it like a bunch of dumbasses, they run away.
Would it be reasonable to assume that by some Darwinian evolution, a species could evolve into what could be identified as gods?
You'd actually have to define your terms first. What is a god? Just saying God doesn't mean anything. How do you define that? How do you demonstrate that? What is a god anyhow? If you're just saying that it's some very powerful biological entity, then I don't find that to be a very useful definition. Because compared to, say, an amoeba, humans are already gods by that definition. But I don't think we're very godlike, do you? I don't find that very useful, and utility is really what we need to be looking for here. Come up with a definition for what a god is, and we'll talk about it. Because absent that, there's no point to really answering the question.
Could mankind evolve into gods?
See my answer to the last question. Because honestly, until you can actually define what you mean by gods, this isn't a question that can be answered in any way.
What is it about the Homo sapiens that we have evolved the way we have into being so technologically advanced compared to other species?
We were just in the right place at the right time, really. This isn't really a useful question either when you think about it. What is it about the cheetah that made them so fast? What is it about the tardigrade that made them so hardy under adverse conditions? What is it about the sailfish that makes them swim so quickly? The answer is nothing. Nothing at all. That's just the way that it all happened to work out. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who are looking for a why when there really isn't a why. There is a how, but there's no purpose to any of it. There's no reason to any of it. And a lot of people really want a purpose. Well, you don't always get what you want, huh? So you need to be able to ask rational questions first. You need to understand if this is a good question to ask, and if the answer that could be provided is actually going to be utilitarian. And at the moment, for the last couple, they're really not. So how about moving forward? You give it a try.
Could it be possible that the conscious, like basic matter itself, can neither be destroyed into nothing nor created from nothing?
But you'd have to demonstrate that first. What is theoretically possible is entirely irrelevant if it isn't actually true. In fact, we actually know this isn't the case. Consciousness is an emergent property of the physical brain. That's what 100% of the evidence that we actually have shows conclusively. If you damage the brain sufficiently, you damage consciousness. If you damage the brain too much, you end consciousness. It just goes away. And this is true in 100% of all cases. You can reset memories. You can completely alter the personality. In fact, there are tons and tons and tons of case studies where this has been demonstrated to be true. I mean, just take one for example, like Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker who in 1823 suffered a traumatic injury when a steel rod penetrated into his brain and destroyed large parts of the frontal lobe. Gage not only survived, but he went back to work almost immediately, because that's kind of how it was back then. You know, walk it off. But his personality was almost completely rewritten with the injury. He went from being a very well-liked, thoughtful individual to a cruel man who lost all social inhibitions. This is one of the earliest cases that indicated the link between the brain and the conscious state. Whether you like it or not, you are your brain. When your brain dies, so do you. When your brain changes, so do you. That's just the way it goes. Learn to deal with reality.
Could it be possible that the spirit could be some form of matter?
Define spirit and prove that it exists. Because this is where we typically have a lot of problems with the religious. They've been brainwashed into believing all kinds of indemonstrable nonsense because it appeals to their fifis, and let's be honest, that's really just childish. There is no evidence, at least not that I've ever seen, and I'm perfectly willing to be proven wrong, but it's going to take evidence, that any form of spirit actually exists in reality. So you've got all of your work ahead of you. Come on back when you've got any evidence to actually support it. Because I suspect it's going to be a very, very, very long wait.
If Jean-Paul Sartre is correct when he said, existence precedes essence, how much of an essence would we have if we have always existed by way of having a pre-mortal life? How radically free would we be?
Now, if you want to get into existentialism, that's up to you, I suppose. I've never been a fan of just noodling your navel for no demonstrable return. This is another place where if seems to look an awful lot like because, right? And we've dealt with this before. The religious tend to have a big problem with this. They think that if God exists, in their head it just translates to because God exists, because they can't really consider if. They can't really say, well, I'm not really sure, because their faith insists that they must be. So that's not impressive either. I'm really questioning every section of this statement. It all seems to come from Fifi land, and it's really hard to even know what to make of it, so, I guess I won't. Next!
Could the doctrine of the premortal life to explain the free agency of man and that we all knew what would happen to us on earth yet chose to come here anyways? The doctrine of salvation for the dead to explain that God gives equal chances to all men and women, and the prospects of a God who weeps be enough to solve the problem of evil?
That's just a whole bunch of theological mumbo-jumbo that hasn't been demonstrated to even be reasonable, much less true. This is not remotely impressive. It's just, hey, can all of this stuff that my religion just made up out of whole cloth solve a problem that most theists don't even understand in the first place? Before you even try to get to any of that, you've got to demonstrate it, and let's be honest, the religious don't even try. It's just accepted as true because their faith insists that it has to be true. But that doesn't mean that it's true. That's a really good reason to reject faith as a rational path to truth, isn't it? You haven't proven that pre-mortal life is even real. You haven't proven that it even means anything in the first place. It's just a bunch of words strung together. You haven't proven that anyone chose to come here in the first place. You haven't shown that there are any gods that are reasonable to accept. You haven't shown how you know anything about the mindset of any of these supposed gods in the first place. And in the end, it's not really even worthwhile to chase down without some good reason to think that any of it makes sense to begin with. Anybody can do that. Anybody at all. In fact, all religions do that. That's how they function. You can just make up any characteristic for the flying spaghetti monster that you want, but that doesn't make it reasonable to believe because the flying spaghetti monster isn't real. You've got a whole lot more work to do before anybody should take any of this crap seriously. Go right ahead. We'll wait.
If you found the Book of Mormon to be a real historical document, what would that mean for the Bible?
What difference does it make? These are questions for atheists. I think so. Let's go look at your video. Yeah, no, these are questions for atheists. We don't care about the Bible. We don't care about the Book of Mormon. These haven't been demonstrated to be valid sources of information to begin with. First off, the Book of Mormon isn't real. I mean, it's real, it's a physical book, but it's not even defensible. It was written by a con man. There is no evidence at all for any of it. And the same goes for the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas and all the rest. All supernatural claims, which I suppose is what's being talked about here, none of it is remotely defensible. So what the hell is the point? I don't know, you tell me. Because here's where we tend to have problems with the religious, and I'm just explaining this because it's important to understand. The religious just assume that all of the beliefs and the faith and all the things that come from their religion, well, that's just got to be true. And then they go and they talk to people who don't share those beliefs, who don't share that faith. And they lose the fact that we don't think any of that stuff is true. And if you want us to discuss this on an equal footing, you have to A, stop believing that stuff is true for the sake of argument so that we can come to an equal decision, or prove that all that stuff is true so that we can come to an equal footing and then continue our discussion. But they don't seem capable of doing that, do they? They want to believe it's true, and in their heads, they want to think that everybody else automatically thinks it too. And they're just wrong.
What are your thoughts on Latter-day Saints compared to other Christians or other religions?
They're all the same, generally speaking. Overly emotional children who are terrified of reality and are just looking for a safe space to hide in where they can be comforted and taken care of by an imaginary man in the sky. It's all the same kind of crazy, just with different hats. And I don't care if any of that makes you happy, because your happiness doesn't remotely impact objective reality. And that's the only thing that matters. If you want to be a reasonable, rational person, you need to throw off all of the blind faith and the wishful thinking and just accept what is defensible. Just accept what is demonstrable. If you can find a way back to your faith, great. That's fine. We'll all go together if you can prove that it's true. But if you can't, you've got no business believing any of that crap either. You need to be rational first. Give that a shot.
I understand that I cannot convince you of the possibility of the existence of a literal God, such that I believe, but could I perhaps persuade you towards a metaphorical God?
No, not without evidence. What is the point of a metaphorical God? That would really need to be discussed before I could even begin to answer this question. I don't care about what makes you happy. I care what is actually so in the objective reality that we all share. And there is no evidence for any God, at least not that I've ever seen. And if you have some, by all means, present it. But no theist can, and that's why they're not able to convince me that any gods exist. In fact, they shouldn't believe that one exists either, but we all know the religious have some problems. So why would we need or care about a metaphorical God? What the hell is the point? Please explain. And of course, that was the last question, so we're never going to get anywhere, are we? It's where we really have to start asking serious questions and expecting coherent answers, and the religious don't tend to have any of those, do they? Why do we need a God at all? Not why do they want a God? We understand that. They're terrified to live in the real world. They are actively seeking emotional comfort, not objective truth. They've got some serious ideological and emotional problems, let's be serious. Now, to his credit, he did a fair bit of responding to people in the comments of his video, and I think that's admirable, especially given the number of religious videos that we see that just close down comments and hide from the people that they're supposedly trying to talk to, because they're not really trying to talk to us, are they? How many questions for atheist videos have we seen where the comments are closed and nobody can actually answer? That makes no sense at all. Yet these all seem to have the same kind of problems that we typically see. They are operating from the assumption that everything that they already believe is true, often that everybody else already accepts that they're true, even if they say they don't, and anyone who questions the foundation of their faith, well, things don't tend to go very well, do they? There's always that base assumption that, well, of course everything I believe is right. They don't have to justify anything, they're just right and everybody else is wrong, so there. Yet, that's not how intelligent, rational conversations happen. You need to be able to back up your claims with objectively verifiable evidence, and these people never, ever can. The second they realize that they can't get to a place that a skeptic would just blindly accept, they always turn tail and run away, throwing childish insults behind them as if that's going to change our minds. That's just how religion works. It's how all religion works. This isn't something that anybody ought to be proud of. So that's a bunch of questions down. It's better than some of the ones we've looked at, but yeah, they still have a lot of problems. Will we ever see a credible response from the Saints theory? I'd like to think so, but I wouldn't be holding my breath.
bum 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 bum.